They're also pledging billions to fight the global food crisis and plan to phase out subsidies for fossil fuel. We'll go live to the closing address from the summit here in Germany. Hello, I'm Terry Martin. Thanks for joining us. Leaders of the G7 group of nations are ending their three-day summit in Germany with further sanctions on Russia for its ongoing attacks on Ukraine. U.S. officials said G7 countries would try to put a cap on the price of Russian oil to limit its revenue. They're also expected to pledge several $1 billion to address a global food crisis. We'll bring you the closing address from the summit live later this hour. But first, here's a look at the issues on the agenda.
At this luxury hotel nestled in the Bavarian Alps, talk of war is dominating discussions at this year's G7 summit, specifically options to support Ukraine and expand sanctions on Russia. In a closed-door session via video link, Ukraine's president asked world leaders to help end the war before winter, when conditions would become tougher for his troops.
We all have assured that we will continue to support Ukraine in its defense against Russia. What's clear is that war is a deep, deep cut in international relations. All the rules, all the agreements that we have made with each other, the cooperation of states, all has been broken, especially the understanding that borders should not be moved by force.
The G7 is considering capping Russian oil prices and imposing sanctions on gold exports as a way to further target Vladimir Putin's revenue streams while minimizing spillover effects. The war is already driving up food and fuel prices around the world, as well as inflation rates. Several developing economies have been invited to take part in this year's summit, joining working groups focused on energy and food security.
Here in the studio with me is DW's chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane, and covering G7 events at the summit itself in nearby Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Bavaria. For us is DW's Brussels bureau chief, Alexandra von Namen. Good to have you both with us. We're going to be going through the summit. Hopefully we'll get some live pictures there from the final press conference at the summit. Let's start with you, Alexandra. Final statements from G7 leaders will be made shortly. The declaration was just released. What's the big takeaway from this summit?
Well, I think indeed that the big takeaway from this summit is that the G7 leaders remained united, not only when it comes to their support for Ukraine and the condemnation of Russia's brutal war there, but also when it comes to the pressing issues that were on the agenda with regards to the state of the global economy. Even though we know that there were different proposals on the table, with some countries pushing for bolder measures, others being more restrictive, we now have them all united and saying that they are ready to study price caps, for instance, on Russian oil and gas. And we know that the final communique also mentions a ban on Russian gold imports. They are going to pledge, as you just mentioned, $4.5 billion to address global hunger. They were also speaking about climate change, inviting other countries to join a climate club. I'm sorry, this is quite loud here. I think you can hear it with helicopters landing nearby. So I think that the big takeaway is that the leaders are united.
As you were speaking there, Alexandra, I believe we were looking at some live pictures of the summiteers gathering. Oh, I'm told they're not live. There's just some file pictures of the leaders of the G7 gathering at that summit. Melinda Crane, our chief political correspondent, is with us here in the studio. Melinda, we just heard Alexandra mention the possibility of putting a price cap on Russian oil. That's something that the G7 leaders are aspiring to. They don't have a clear plan for that yet, but Any idea how that's supposed to work?
Yes, and it's complex, which is why we probably won't hear a definitive statement on exactly how this is to be done. But apparently they are quite close to agreeing on a cap, and a cap would have essentially two advantages for the G7 leaders. First of all, it would deny Vladimir Putin the windfall profits that he has been getting, because despite the fact that the West is trying to wean itself off of Russian fossil fuels, the prices of those fossil fuels have been soaring, and Putin has been able to divert supplies from the West to China, India, and other countries. Therefore, he, in fact, has more money in his war chest rather than less. So trying to put a cap on the Russian oil price would clearly serve that aim of reducing the gains to him. But it would also be an attempt to try to bring these runaway fuel prices under control, and also drivers of inflation under control. And as you know, those fuel prices are badly hurting not simply the G7 countries represented here, but also very much the global South, the most vulnerable in many countries, including those invited yesterday in the outreach session, are they seeing the poorest in those countries unable to pay for cooking oil and essentially facing a major hunger crisis. So that would be the aim. The mechanism is that they would seek to impose sanctions, apparently, on the main insurer for Russian oil tankers, and that would then ensure that that company would be sanctioned unless it kept the prices down.
We'll be coming back to that, I'm sure, Melinda, because it's very important, this mechanism, how that cap on Russian oil prices is supposed to work, and not everyone understands it at this point. I'm not sure the summiteers have really worked it out themselves. But I wanted to ask you a question about the U.S. President Joe Biden. He's leaving this summit just as we speak. I understand his motorcade has just left the venue. How was this summit for Joe Biden? This is a rather critical juncture for him and his presidency. He's got major domestic problems at the moment, but the world economy is also weighing on him and the U.S. economy, and of course the conflict, the war in Ukraine that Russia has launched there. How has this worked out for Joe Biden's priorities at the summit?
Well, certainly he was intent upon delivering the message that Alexander talked about a moment ago, namely that the West remains completely united. And you'll remember, as the G7 summit got underway, he stood in front of the cameras with Chancellor Scholz, praised Germany's work in dealing with the Ukraine crisis. And also, both sides said transatlantic unity has never been stronger. The U.S. is absolutely at the forefront, essentially, of keeping this together. Now, that is an important message for Joe Biden at home as well as abroad, but will it shore up domestic support in the U.S.? Probably not. What he needs to deliver is really concrete action to bring inflation down. The Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank in the U.S. is working on that, but people really want to see changes at the gas tank. They want to see changes when they go grocery shopping, and whether anything that has been decided here in Bavaria can really bring inflation down quickly is a very, very open question.
You were just looking at live pictures there of I believe it's the motorcade of President Joe Biden leaving the venue. Again, I'm told they are not live pictures. They are just the pictures of Joe Biden's motorcade leaving the venue. But you can get a sense of just how large security is, a massive motorcade involved in putting all that together. Let's go back to Bavaria, where Alexandra von Naumann is standing by. Alexandra, this summit for Joe Biden was significant, of course, as it was for all of the leaders there. But why is he leaving this summit early and not delivering a final statement as many of the others are?
Yes, and he was actually also expected to deliver a statement ahead of the working session today. However, then the U.S. administration has decided to leave earlier because they were concerned that weather conditions that are expected to get worse will prevent the U.S. president from traveling further on to the NATO summit in Madrid. And that is why, of course, security is priority here. They decided that it is the right thing to do to leave earlier to be on time in Madrid for this very important NATO summit there.
Alexandria, thank you for now. Melinda, thank you for now. We're going to move on to another pressing topic as, of course, we wait for the final news conference that's going to be held at the summit venue there in Schloss Elmau. And, of course, we'll be bringing that to you live. Well, G7 leaders have condemned Russia for carrying out a missile strike on a busy shopping mall in central Ukraine, calling that attack a war crime. At least 18 people were killed on Monday when missiles hit the building in the city of Kremenchuk. Around 1,000 shoppers were reported to be inside at the time. Ukraine has requested a United Nations Security Council meeting over the strike.
Rescue services work through the night, looking for survivors still trapped in the collapsed mall. Dozens of severely injured victims, some with life-threatening wounds, have been taken to local hospitals in Kremenchuk. They describe harrowing scenes just after the Russian missiles struck.
I flew through the air and shrapnel hit my body. The whole place was collapsing. Then I landed on the floor, and I don't know if I was conscious or unconscious. I didn't understand anything. I opened my eyes and I saw a big piece of rubble was on top of me. And I started to scream, "Help me."
Officials say the missile struck when over 1,000 people were inside the shopping mall. Hundreds of rescue and emergency service workers are still scouring the rubble, searching for survivors.
According to the preliminary police report, there are still people inside the shopping centre.
Kremenchuk is an important transportation hub and home to the country's biggest oil refinery. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky described the strike as a terrorist act designed to coincide with the mall's busiest hours and cause maximum loss of life.
Only absolute psycho-terrorists, who should have no place on Earth, can launch missiles at such an object. And it's not an incidental hit by missiles, it's a precise Russian strike, exactly on this shopping centre.
Russia has recently stepped up its missile strikes across Ukraine. Shelling of Kharkiv on Monday killed 5 people and wounded 22 more, including 5 children, according to authorities. The northeastern city has suffered heavy bombardment since the very start of the Russian invasion on February 24th.
There were such explosions, I don't even know how to describe them. Windows were shaking. Someone told me something happened to my father-in-law. I came closer. He was laying down, still alive. Literally, within 10 minutes he started wheezing, and that was it.
Despite Russia's claims it isn't targeting civilians, it's once again Ukraine's unarmed population that's paying a heavy price for the Russian invasion.
Well, for the latest developments in Ukraine, let's talk to our correspondent, Emmanuel Chaz, in Kiev. Emmanuel, what's the latest on this shopping mall attack? What do we know?
Well, Terry, over 20 people are now accounted for dead after this deadly missile strike. And to just give you an idea as to how how terrible this strike was, well, the bodies are so badly burned that they will only be identified through DNA testing. There's over 60 people who have been injured, some very badly, and there's dozens of people still missing, with the authorities, as was mentioned in the report, qualifying this act as a terrorist act against the Ukrainian population.
Now, I know you're also monitoring the reaction to this attack. It's been widely condemned, of course. Tell us more about international reaction to this.
Well, first of the reactions here in Kiev was that of a very strong shock and emotion among the population. And unfortunately, they have been accustomed to horrible reports, such reports of shedding of civilians. But on the international stage, there have also been quite a few strong reactions, not least that of the G7 leaders, who issued a statement condemning this brutal attack. They also said that this indiscriminate type of attack on innocent civilians civilians constitute a war crime, and this happened, they say, as Russia unfolded an unjustified war of choice since February 24th against Ukraine. Also, important reaction from the United Nations, which said yesterday in a statement that whatever the number of casualties ends up to be, the attack on a shopping mall, any attack on a shopping mall, is utterly deplorable.
As we're seeing these strikes on Ukrainian cities by Russian forces, we've also seen a strike earlier in Kiev. The fight, of course, in Donbass, in the east of the country, is continuing. What's happening in Donbass?
Well, Terry, the situation is as it was for a few months now, as it continues to be very dire in the Donbass region. In the city of Lysychansk, Russian troops tried to storm in from the southern flank of the city. Civilians are urged by Ukrainian armed forces to flee if they can. But Terry, yesterday, some of them were trying to get water out of a tank because they no longer have, running water, running electricity. That just goes on to show you just how dire the situation is. Well, even civilians trying to get water were shelled. There have been at least 7 people who died during that strike and another 22 injured. It just seems that it's a never-ending horror just unfolding of the country, and there's very much the feeling that nowhere in Ukraine really is safe anymore.
Emma, thank you very much. That was our correspondent, Emmanuel Schaz, there in Kiev. Now to the United States and a tragedy in Texas. Authorities there have discovered the bodies of at least 46 people in an abandoned truck. First responders were called to the truck on the outskirts of San Antonio after a cry for help was heard. Officials say a further 16 people, including 4 children, were taken to hospital. The location is 250 kilometers from the U.S.-Mexican border and is a major transit route for people smugglers.
A normally quiet San Antonio road transformed by tragedy. Authorities were alerted to the scene in the city's southwestern outskirts on Monday evening, after a worker in a nearby building heard a cry for help and found the trailer with its doors ajar and dead bodies within. Officials said 46 people thought to be migrants from Central and Southern America were found dead at the scene, while 16 survivors were taken to hospitals suffering from heat-related conditions.
The patients that we saw were hot to the touch. They were suffering from heat stroke, heat exhaustion, no signs of water in the vehicle. It was a refrigerated tractor trailer, but there was no visible working AC unit on that rig. We're not supposed to open up a truck and see stacks of bodies in there. None of us come to work imagining that. So we're working through the behavioral health for our folks right now.
San Antonio's mayor was also at the scene on Monday.
So the plight of migrants seeking refuge is always a humanitarian crisis, but tonight we are dealing with a horrific human tragedy.
Local police say they have taken 3 people into custody, but that it isn't clear if they were directly connected with the incident. A federal investigation into just who left these people to die in a hot trailer is underway.
Let's take a look at some other stories making headlines around the world today. A German court has sentenced a former Nazi concentration camp guard to 5 years in prison. Josef Schutz, seen here in file footage, was found guilty of being an accessory to murder. At 101 years old, he's the oldest person so far to go on trial for their part in the Holocaust. At least 3 people are dead and dozens more injured after a train derailed in the U.S. state of Missouri. The train was carrying some 243 passengers and a dozen crew members. It derailed after hitting a dump truck at a level crossing. Indigenous groups in Ecuador have met with the government to try to put an end to the 2-week-long nationwide unrest sparked by high living costs. The protesters have rejected the government's newly announced fuel price cuts. They say they're insufficient and have vowed to continue the demonstrations. The Japanese capital, Tokyo, has recorded its highest June temperature in nearly 150 years. The thermometer topped 35 degrees on Tuesday, with the heat wave set to continue in the coming days. Authorities are urging people to try and reduce their electricity use in order to avoid power cuts. At least 12 people are dead and 250 more have been injured after a tank filled with 30 tons of chlorine ruptured in Jordan's port city of Aqaba. The tank fell as it was being loaded, released a poisonous cloud of chlorine gas that quickly spread across the harbor.
A moment of horror. A storage tank carrying 30 tons of chlorine falls from a winch and slams into the deck of the ship below, causing an explosion of lethal yellow smoke. State TV ran video showing the moment the tank exploded, sending dock workers at the Red Sea port scrambling to escape the toxic cloud. Jordan's Prime Minister, Bisher al-Kassawane, visited a hospital where the sick are being treated. I heard from the director of the hospital that admissions, the number of cases, are decreasing. This is thanks to God and your efforts when you received the first batch of people and provided them with the necessary care. I assigned the Interior Minister to head a team to hold an investigation into the incident. His Majesty and the Crown Prince are following. Authorities initially described the accident as a gas leak. The area was sealed off after evacuating the injured and specialists were sent in. A widely used disinfectant and water purification agent, chlorine can be fatal if inhaled in large concentrations. Health officials urge people to stay inside and close windows and doors. The nearest residential area is 25 kilometers away. Aqaba is on the northern tip of the Red Sea, next to the Israeli city of Eilat, which is just across the border.
We're turning now to our main story, the G7 summit here in Germany. We're just waiting for the final press conference by the leaders, starting with the host, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Here with me in the studio is DW's chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane. And on location in Bavaria, near the summit venue, is our Brussels bureau chief, Alexandra van Namen. Alexandra, first of all, how close are we to this final news conference?
Sorry, can you repeat it again? I didn't get your question.
Yeah, we're just waiting for that final news conference. I was wondering if you can tell us when it might begin.
Yeah, well, we really don't know, because actually they should have started this press conference a while ago. But of course, as the discussions are still ongoing, it's always the normal thing to wait for the host of the G7 meeting to start his final conference. So I think that we will see him soon and giving us a summary of how this whole meeting went and what kind of concrete solutions they were able to achieve.
Yeah, okay. We're seeing some live pictures from the venue there. The podium is being set up, and we've got an audience forming now. So perhaps it won't be too long before that gets underway at Schloss Elmau, which you're seeing there in southern Germany. Alexandra, the war in Ukraine has been a focus of this summit, very much so, both the war itself and the repercussions around the world. What about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky? He addressed the conference himself by video link. The G7 urged G7 leaders to give more weapons, to provide more backing for the war against Russia. What have G7 leaders actually agreed on in relation to Ukraine?
Well, they agreed to continue supporting Ukraine as long as it takes, which I thought was a quite strong statement. They want to provide Ukraine with economic, military and, of course, diplomatic support. And they also condemned Russia's illegal and brutal war on Ukraine, saying that they are committed to continuing imposing sanctions on the Russian regime. I don't think that we are going to see any announcement with regard to weapons deliveries, because that is rather something that will be discussed at the upcoming NATO summit in Madrid that is due to start this evening. But I think that the message that the G7 leaders wanted to send is that they are determined to continue supporting Ukraine, that of course it is up to Ukraine to decide when the time is right to start talks with Russia, and that Russia cannot dictate any peace settlement here. That was also a very important statement that I think the Ukrainian government was looking forward to receiving. And what was also important was the pledge by the G7 leaders to provide Ukraine not only with humanitarian help, but also with almost 30 billion euros of budget help. That is, of course, very important for the country, where the government is saying that they need up to $5 billion a month to avoid an economic collapse.
We're just, as you're speaking there, Alexandra, we've been watching some live footage. This is live footage, I'm told, of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz approaching the venue for the press conference. So we presume that is going to get underway in just a moment. With me in the studio is Melinda Crane, our chief political correspondent. She's following all of this, of course. Melinda, we just heard Alexandra referring to this pledge for Ukraine, nearly $30 billion, I believe, or euros to help Ukraine deal with its basic needs, to provide its basic needs. They've also been looking at infrastructure needs in the rebuilding effort that is to follow the war whenever it is over. What have you seen coming from the G8 that would constitute some significant development that we haven't seen before?
We have to take one number off that. G7 it is now.
G7, sorry. Yeah, thanks.
I think essentially the big news was the commitment on rebuilding assistance that was made by the finance ministers of the G7 directly before this summit actually began. But we heard Chancellor Scholz call for what he has called a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. The Marshall Plan being, of course, the enormous support from the U.S. after World War II that got Europe, and most especially Germany, back on its feet, not only economically, but also politically, that essentially gave Germany the stability to become a flourishing democracy. And clearly that's the aim also here, to ensure that Ukraine, which is now going to be a candidate for EU membership status, that it has the secure economic basis and the reconstruction that will enable democracy to flourish once this war is over. So certainly there was unity on that point. I think overall, when we look at the degree to which these leaders are unified, certainly in the messaging, yes. But on some of the concrete measures that they've been talking about, apparently there isn't full agreement on how fast to move and how concretely to move. And I'm talking both about a ban on Russian gold imports. We may hear more. Gold is Russia's second biggest resource, second biggest earner after oil and gas.
Of foreign revenues, yeah.
The U.S. had really wanted to push fast with this. It made it clear in the first press conference by President Biden. And I think we're going to leave it there.
The German Chancellor is approaching the podium there in at Schloss Elmau in Bavaria. I mentioned, I said G8, slipped up and said G8, and that is because Russia was a member of this group until 2014. After it annexed Crimea, it was kicked out of the group. It had joined in 1998 following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and there was efforts to integrate Russia into the international community. That was very much a part of that effort. So there's Chancellor Scholz approaching the podium. We're going to listen in. I believe the news conference is about to begin. You're looking at live pictures from the G7 conference taking place in Bavaria. Final news conference. Here we go.
Final press conference with the Federal Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Ladies and gentlemen, I too would like to welcome you here. We had intense and constructive days behind us now, and the G7 summit in Elmau was an important summit in a very special time. And this showed us very clearly how we stand together and how decisive we are to show and counter the Russian aggression. 125 days. This is how long the war has been going on against Ukraine. As a G7, as the group of the strong democracies, we condemn this terrible war. The missile attack yesterday at a shopping center in Kremenchuk near Kiev caused a lot of fatalities and casualties and showed us once again that Putin is continuing his brutal aggression vis-à-vis the population. G7, as you know, stand close together and support Ukraine. We support the country, we support its defense, and we offer them a perspective for the future. Here, we also discussed a number of different points with regard to the attack which began on the 24th of February and what it means. I called this a watershed moment. Nothing is as it was before. We all are clear about one thing. There can be no way back, and it will not be the same as before this war. We're also aware of one more thing. We have a period of uncertainty before us. It will be challenging, and that's why decisiveness is very, very important. And it's even more important because we have close friends and allies in this world. The 7 countries that came together here are such good friends and allies. I made that very clear, and I felt that very clearly in our meetings here in Elmau, in our discussions, in our conversations, bilateral discussions, and also with our encounters that we had again and again. Elmau was a very good meeting for G7 and the countries that cooperate here. We made use of the time. The G7 partners, as well as the partner countries that were invited, Senegal, Indonesia, India, South Africa, and Argentina. They, in my opinion, showed us once again that we can see consensus in working together in our world for the future. That was also very important. We weren't just amongst ourselves as the G7. These other international organizations came together as well. They were here as our partners in discussion, so we can talk about what democracies can achieve together. And that is also very important, on a par. With today's final communique with the heads of government and state and government, which we have then agreed on here in Elmau, we are showing once again the strength of democratic alliances. In Elmau, we have 3 messages we'd like to give you. First of all, G7 stands together in their support for Ukraine. We agree that President Putin must not win this war. And we will continue to support and we will drive the costs high economically and politically for President Putin. And that's why it's important to stand together. Even if it's a long course, we will have to stand. We will also counter the Russian narrative, saying that it's a conflict where only the West, the global West, it's not only the global West that condemns this aggression and the rest of the world is just watching. No, that is not the case. We have seen this in our discussions. For peace worldwide, we have to consider the inalienable borders, and also this is something that is important, that countries can determine their own fate and not to be attacked by their neighbors. As G7, we also came up with a number of discussions. In other words, to organize financial aid, budgetary aid, $29 billion taken together. All of this has been mobilized. And we will continue to provide humanitarian support. This has also occurred in 2022 and will add up to $2.8 billion. And of course, this includes giving Ukraine military support, and we will providing weapons. Many other countries are doing so as well. We have also talked about the long-term reconstruction. We also will have additional money that will be mobilized for this purpose, but we need to come together and we have to talk about G7, but also other European Union members to talk about discussing reconstruction. We need a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. This needs to be planned well and developed well. That is one of our goals. The second message is that we are fighting famine worldwide, and this is an even greater challenge as a result of the Russian attack on Ukraine. This is Russia's war that is making a lot of people worry that they will no longer be able to feed themselves and their families. Right now, we see 345 million people, and we know that they don't have enough to eat. That's 4 times as many people that live in Germany. The climate crisis, the pandemic, and the war from Russia, they have made these problems even worse. This is an existential threat in many countries in Africa in particular. That is why we want to take action, and that is why we have come up with a global alliance for food security. We have $4.5 billion committed, and Germany is involved in this significantly as well. Here we're talking about very specific steps, and this also includes working together with the Secretary General of the United Nations so that grain and fertilizer, which is being stored in Ukraine, should also be made available to the rest of the world. Of course, this war has also showed how dependent we are on energy from Russia in particular, energy imports. And that is why we have to reduce this dependency, and that is why this is something we discussed and decided together. We will also expand renewable energies and work even more intensively on this. And that is why the decisions that we took show that when it comes to financing fossil sources of energy, this is something that is to come to an end. But of course, in this very specific situation we are now in, we will be helping many countries if they need to make investments for being hydrogen ready. They will make use of this opportunity as long as this is in line with the 1.5 degree centigrade target from the Paris Agreement. Increases in energy costs, these are a danger to safety, security, and stability in many countries. We know that, and that's something that we talked about when we talked about the economic situation worldwide. We also see the major threat of inflation. This is something that we can see in many countries, and that is where many people are very much concerned. And that's why it's good we found time to discuss these questions as well. This applies to us, but also for the situation in emerging and developing countries. They are being challenged even more by this situation. They have fewer possibilities to deal with such major challenges. Price increases, inflation can lead to economic instability, or it can underpin stability, and that's why it's important that we act together. The third message from our G7 summit is that we will not forget about our long-term diverse tasks. We want to have progress for a just world, and we want to do justice to our global responsibility. This applies to climate protection. We talked about the question of a climate club, which I proposed quite some time ago, and that's why we agreed, and I'm very happy to say that we will be setting up such a climate club by the end of the year. We laid the cornerstone here, and the next steps have already been agreed on, because we agree we need more ambition in order to achieve our climate targets. The climate club will make a contribution to meeting these commitments, and we also want to see to it that if we consider our national strategies, when these are developed and we want to have CO2 neutral industries, and we also want to implement all of this, we don't want to be working against one another. We don't want to set ourselves apart from one another. We want to cooperate here, and that's why this will be possible in an open climate club. That's why our competitiveness will be maintained, and that climate protection can be a competitive edge and not a drawback. This also applies to the energy transition, because the emerging and developing countries need to be involved. And that's why we also want to set the cornerstone here so that these countries can indeed be involved. We have energy transformation with South Africa, and this is also something where we have made 700 million in contributions and a KfW loan of 300 million euros. The South African president was very pleased with this and the JETPs. And we will continue to initiate additional partnerships with India, Indonesia, Senegal, and Vietnam. We've planned these already. And what we want to do is cooperate with one another. Once again, one thing that brings us all together, and that is our common values: democracy, human rights, peace, and freedom. This also brings us together with our partner countries, and they were invited to join us here, as I said: Senegal, Indonesia, South Africa, Argentina, and India. These are democratic voices from the global South, and they are the right partners for us to discuss these problems of our common world. And we will only manage this if we work together. And we want to have progress for a just world. And that is why we will also discuss things in this way, as was the case here in Elmo. I think that this summit is extremely important. We don't really benefit all that much where politicians get together, oftentimes by video, and then simply read out their statements. You need to have direct discussions. You have to have bilateral discussions and discuss the different possibilities. And then you can pick up on them a day later or 2 days later. And this is successful here. So it really was, it paid off for us to talk to one another. We have a great deal of confidence amongst one another, and this is something that will help us up for the time ahead. I'd also like to thank everyone here who works at the Elmo Castle. They contributed a great deal to the success of our summit with their hospitality. It was excellent. It was lovely to experience all of this. I'd also like to thank to the police and the emergency forces who worked here, and they were here day and night to make sure that we could have a secure meeting. The Bavarian police, the federal police, and many, many others as well. I'd also like to thank the population from Garmisch-Partenkirchen and Kroon. These types of meetings are always a type of burden for the people, and that's why I'd like to say thank you very much. Thank you for your understanding. Thank you for support, and I'm sure thank you for the perseverance you had. Once again, thank you on behalf of all of the delegations who were here with us in Elmont. They were happy to be here as your guests. The G7 presidency, and this is an important point, it hasn't come to an end yet. It will go on until the end of the year. And as I said at the beginning, this is a very special year, and that's why we will probably have a lot more discussions with one another. And it will work even much better because we made such good use of our time here in Elmo. This is a message of clarity and strength, and this type of message is also very important. Just before the Madrid NATO NATO summit, which I'll be leaving for today. Here we'll be talking about transatlantic partnership. And this shows what we are capable of, and that we can defend our countries and our democracies, and that we organize this jointly.
And you've been listening to a live news conference being delivered at Schloss Elmau Castle in Bavaria, where the G7 meeting of the world's rich democracies has been taking place. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been speaking first. We're going to be hearing from the leaders of several other countries as well. We hope to hear from President Emmanuel Macron of France very soon. And we've got, let's listen into the questions that he's taking up from journalists.
I would like to know why you were so reserved and why you let the Americans have center stage. And how do you see your role in the deliberations? How would you describe your role? Were you more a moderator, or did you also play the role of leader here? Thank you for the very nice questions. Well, first of all, I have the impression that we came up with joint results, that we communicated jointly, so I don't share your observation. And this was a very good discussion we had, and it was strict. We had the results that we prepared and that we discussed and worked on them together. And I'm pleased that I was able to make an important contribution. G7 chairmanship is not just the time of the meetings. There's a whole lot more involved. The next one is Daniela Fahrt. Thank you. Mr. Scholz, I would like to ask about the Ukraine. At G7, did you come up with any new ideas as to how this war can be contained? And did you talk about price caps and what the developments there will be? Ukraine, as I said before, played a central role. We spent a lot of time on it, and that is rightly so. This war is a huge challenge for peace in Europe and in the world. That's important. It's not just a war in Europe and the rules that have all been broken. Here we can see that this is a threat to peace and security worldwide. And that's why we discussed all sorts of things together. And when we're talking about financial support, when we're talking about humanitarian assistance, also the question of sanctions, and also a question of weapons delivery, because we see Ukraine in a position to defend itself. The discussions were very specific, and this also meant that we, once again, everyone can say that we not only act together, but we all say that this all fits in together, everything that we do together. And I think that's what gives us the strength for the future. At present, we have to note that Putin is continuing his brutal war, and that's why it's so very important for us to announce once again that our assistance will continue to be a lot of assistance. We will continue it as long as is necessary. The next one is Ralph Goldman from FAS. Go ahead, in the middle. Mr. Scholz, you agreed on the global south, and you asked about Russia and Ukraine. What about the sanctions policy and circumventing the sanctions? There seemed to be difference of opinion there. Did you take your position and the position of the G7? Did they understand this better than they did before? Were you able to achieve anything there? Thank you very much. These questions, of course, were discussed, and we made it very clear. We formulated this very clearly. This is a Russian war of aggression, which is having dramatic effects on the world economy. We can see that already today. We talked about famine. That's a major problem. We see the increase in prices, especially for energy. That's a major problem. That's why we made it clear, and we assured our partners that we need to be solidarity, we have to show solidarity, and that we show them in order to deal with these challenges. And the best way to solve these challenges would be for Russia to stop the war of aggression and to withdraw its troops. And that was a topic we discussed. One thing is clear. In the countries of the Global South, of course, there are differing points of view. I'm sure you can see that in the way the votes went for various countries at the General Assembly in the United Nations. But this is my clear-cut impression. Nobody doubts the cause of this conflict. Nobody we discuss that with here. It's a Russian attack on a neighbor. And they did not provoke this attack, and that they are the victim of aggression. And the next one is Michael Küffner from Deutsche Welle.
Chancellor Scholz, did you discuss amongst each other what security guarantees Ukraine can expect from G7 countries? And Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov announced that he will attend the meeting of 20 coming up in Indonesia. So will the G7 attend that meeting?
One thing is clear. What we want to achieve. We want Ukraine to be able to defend its sovereignty and independence and its future as a democracy. This will also mean that Ukraine also has to be in a position to have a strong defense. And that is why this means that guarantees that we've agreed on to make sure that this works. We have been discussing this for a long time with Ukraine and others as well. We went into more detail on that here, but that is something which has not been so specific to be able to discuss it today. And that is why, nonetheless, one thing is clear. We want to make possible what we can offer, and we want to help them to have a safe future. But right now, the next task is first to see to it that this war comes to an end and that Russia withdraws its troops so that Ukraine can enter into the situation. With regard to the G20, here, in all of our discussions, we agreed that G20 should not be split. That would also say that the countries that were here today would say that they would be splitting it. So it's a question here of talking about this with one another, and our discussions with our partner countries were very, very important to this effect. And now Indonesia is the chair of the G20, and next year it will be India. These are two large, important friends and countries. We work closely with them, and that's why it's important to us, for us to give it a good drive, if I can put it that way, and that's what we are going to work on. Thank you.
Chancellor, I'd like to put a question about China, which you referred to in your final statement as a partner, and I should like to know what you expect from China exactly, and whether you fear that China could undermine the Western sanctions on Russia. Is that a concern of yours, and what do you expect from Beijing? First of all, we expect that the sanctions which we have imposed together with many others on Russia will not be undermined. And this is what we insist upon in all our discussions. And we have discussed this further and have decided that this is going to continue to be the case today. Now, of course, there are a lot of issues linked to China and our work with China, and we need to ensure that we do what is necessary for the future. We have to ensure that we develop our political relations with many different countries and thereby ensure that the balance of power and the balance of political maneuver is what we need for a good development of the world's economy and the world as a whole. China has to fight with its own COVID strategy at the moment. We see that quite clearly, along with many other things.
In
the final declaration, there was a reference to investment in the gas sector. And it was stated that this was something which is very useful. Is it open still at the moment, or is there actually going to be an end to gas imports? Now, well, we do have to realize, of course, that the future does not lie in gas. This is very particular for Germany, and this is something which is going to have an impact on the use of resources, fossil resources, coal, gas, etc. And secondly, for the policies of all the countries which are here in the short term, gas is going to be necessary, and there can be investments in the transitional phase which are going to have to be supported. And this is very much embedded in the question of where we should be going on hydrogen, or also with the issue of how long such resources should be used for. This is something which is very practical, it's very relevant, but there has to be a time before we can achieve what we want. This is something which is embedded within the 1.5-degree target. Politico, Mr. Buchert. Yes, thank you very much, Politico. Chancellor, price caps have been referred to, and there is a rather hesitant statement on oil and an even more hesitant statement on gas. So there seems to be a little skepticism here. Do you think that you can implement what is aimed at? Not just for oil, but also for gas. And also we've talked about this rapid reaction force, which is going to be increased by several hundred. Could you tell us something about that also? As far as your last question goes, what NATO decides is something we're going to support with our moderate German contribution. And of course, it's only possible if you think beforehand what you can actually do. This is something you do have to bear in mind. But we have to ensure that what we decide upon is something we can actually achieve in the end. And this is, of course, something which we want to ensure is the case for Germany. Now, on the issue of price caps on oil exports, or possible price caps, this is a very ambitious, forward-thinking idea in the text. You have noted that, I see, from the way in which you put your question. And this is something which we really have to do. We have to look into this further, work it out before we can answer any other questions. Chancellor, the G7 talked a lot about security guarantees for Ukraine after the war. Could you please tell us about that in a little more detail? What sort of security guarantees would there be? Yes, I could. That was it. I could. I would be able to. That's it.
Michael Grons, Phoenix. Herr Bundeskanzler.
Phoenix, Michael Grons, Chancellor. Over the past week, we had a very definite statement from the BRICS as the club of the future. You had representatives here from South Africa.
Okay, you
so
are
how do you
watching
feel
live coverage from the G7 news conference following the meeting of the G7 in Schloss Elmel Castle in Bavaria, Germany. And that was Chancellor Scholz. We're now looking at the French President, Emmanuel Macron, who's delivering his press conference. Let's listen in.
Much more proteins in Africa. And this was already at the heart, as early as January 21, of the One Planet Summit on Biodiversity in Paris that revived this project of the Great Green Wall. It is about bringing international support to the production in 13 countries, from the Gulf of Guinea to the Horn of Africa. This is a very coherent initiative, and this is combining the agenda to fight desertification and to improve food security as well, in particular in African countries. We'll continue with this work, and please allow me to commend the commitment of the Secretary General of the United Nations, because there's, of course, the necessity of making sure that the cereals that are currently hostages of the war and in Ukraine can come out of the country. We've looked into the maritime possibility from Odessa. We are very much supporting Ukraine. First of all, it requires some discussions between Russia and Ukraine, because they have to make sure that it does not bring about a security challenge for Ukraine, and there's also a Russian responsibility for the Black Sea. So we're well aware of the work done by the UN, and we're continuing as well to work on other possibilities, getting the cereals out of Ukraine through Romania and Moldova. I myself discussed this matter together with both these countries when I was there a few days ago. We're working on getting the cereals out through roads or rivers as well. And we've managed to increase the volumes. Usually, Odessa represents 5 million tons. It was 1.2 million in April, 1.7 in May, and 2 million tons in June. But we need to do more, make sure that these cereals can arrive in the countries where they're most needed, and make sure as well that this is being done before the next harvest takes place in Ukraine, because they will need the storage capabilities. The other issues, of course, we remain mobilized on global health. We went beyond the 1 billion doses of vaccines that we committed in Carbis Bay. Please allow me to insist on two things. First of all, everything that was done to enable production of vaccines in Africa. We need to continue much faster, much further as well. And we made commitments vis-a-vis Senegal and South Africa. You may remember that. A year ago, I was in South Africa, and to very much put in place the first industry cooperation projects to develop production of vaccines in Africa. This is happening, and so when we are now buying vaccines for Africa, we're buying them in Africa. We're not buying them from laboratories in Europe or elsewhere. It's important to bring about solidity to them. And then the crisis underlined the fact that we very much need to continue to support primary care systems, because when they're too fragile, the vaccination campaigns can't be efficient. We also all support the target of protecting 30% of land and seas by 2030. This is something we'll support towards the Convention for Biodiversity in Montreal in December. And we also share the ambition for the digital public order, aiming at building on the existing tools. You have in mind the Christchurch Appeal, the Paris Appeal, as well as the GPAI, the Global Partnership for Artificial Intelligence. And we've been fighting for a number of years already to tackle disinformation in our country and anywhere around the world. And in the margins of ACNU in September, we will also work further on putting together some sort of an IPCC against disinformation. In a nutshell, I'm trying to cover almost everything, but I'm sure I did not cover everything. So this is what I meant to say before answering your questions. Thank you.
De Philippe Ricard du Monde.
A question by Philippe Ripard, Le Monde. Good afternoon. Thank you. Mr. President, you just said that the war was far from over. Do you mean that it is an illusion when Mr. Zelensky said he said in front of the leaders of the G7 that the conflict should end by the end of the year? Do you think this is an illusion? And then a second question. Mr. Putin said that he was ready to stop the fight in one day if the Ukrainian army got the order to stop fighting. What do you think about this statement by Mr. Putin? Well, first of all, I think that one should praise the commitment and the courage of President Zelensky and also the people of Ukraine and its army. And when he says that there is the objective of ending the war by the end of the year, you know that the war has been going on for 4 months, and the end of the year is a long time to go. But we still have to hope, and I do hope forcefully that we can bring the war to an end by the end of the year. But there's one thing that is for sure: Russia cannot and should not win. Well, President Putin clarifies something that I've already said, and this has really means that there is no more ambiguity. Whereas at the beginning of the conflict, when there were some discussions, we had the impression at the beginning that Putin wanted to negotiate, but now the aggression of Russia on Ukraine has one objective for President Putin, that Ukraine really decides to accept not win, and this is not acceptable. So this is not a negotiation, and Ukrainians will have to decide how they want to negotiate so as to bring the war to an end. There is no other option. I think that this is what Mr. Putin said was really there for intimidation, nothing more. Question by Thomas Hemas, Sir Deutsche. Good afternoon.
So good, so I would say in English. You talked a lot about the nutrition crisis, and so my question is, how deep are the concerns that this crisis in Africa and in the Middle East could really escalate the crisis with high food prices and the hunger crisis?
Je pense qu'il y a plusieurs sujets.
I think there are different topics. First of all, in the short run, there is a surge in prices of food, and I think that this is due to several factors. First of all, the lack of stability on global markets, be it for value chains and production chains for many farmers. Why? Because, they not necessarily have access to some grain, which is necessary for feeding cattle, and the distortion on value chains for fertilizers, for example, be it in Africa and in the Middle East and also Southeast Asia. They really were relying very strongly either on nitrogen fertilizer produced directly by Russia or by input from Ukraine. And then there's also speculation. This is something you should never forget. When I take a look at the development in global prices, there is a lot of speculation. And let's not be mistaken. I think that some people are making a lot of money at the moment. So we should find the means to meet this challenge. First of all, we need to release grain from Ukraine. We need to find a way of doing this. And I'd like to really forcefully reaffirm the fact that nothing of what the G7 is doing, there is no sanction on food. This is, again, something that President Putin is saying. It's fake news. Then again, we need to find a technical solution so that nitrogen-based fertilizers can be led to the countries that need it, or that there is an increase in the production. Because it's very technical, but I think that the intermediaries that were using the SWIFT system, we need to find some way of making sure that this product can be exported. This is something that should be done between the European Commission, ASEAN, and the African Union in the coming weeks. This is absolutely crucial. So I think that this is an answer. And then, the Ukrainian production is not going to be up to the usual level. I don't know what the capacity of export will be. So in any case, there is really a destabilization in global markets. There'll be a distortion in markets and in the prices. What is this to mean? It means that there is a risk as to the access to food for part of the population or some vulnerable population. This is the reason why we have put into place a system of monitoring within the United Nations and the World Food Programme so as to be able to meet the needs. So we need really to deliver more food to those populations. We have a system of monitoring and also of rapid response. Now, the food prices surge in many of those countries can lead to a political crisis. I'd like to remind you of the fact that the Arab Spring movement, about 10 years ago, really were due to the surge in bread prices. And, so I think that we all need to be extremely cautious about this. So those are the short-term impacts, and this is how we'll try to meet the needs. And this is also the objective of the farm initiative that we've launched, and we'll organize a summit in a few days in Rome together with FAO on this topic. So the first objective is really to make sure that there is no rare food or famine, no scarcity of some food in some countries, no risk of famine. Also making sure that we don't have over-storage of food in some countries. And we also need to increase our production and target the countries that need it most, and also helping those countries to produce more in the short term. And so this is also the reason why we should find an answer to the nitrogen-based fertilizers.
French President Emmanuel Macron there fielding questions at a press conference following a meeting of the G7 leaders of rich democracies. If you're just joining us, you're watching DW's special coverage of the G7 summit that's taking place in Bavaria. It's been happening over the past 3 days, and of course, we've got special coverage for you now that it's finishing up. Just before Emmanuel Macron, the French president, spoke, we heard from Germany's leader, Olaf Scholz, the chancellor. He was also addressing the press outside. Our correspondent, Michaela Kufner, was there as well. We'll be going to her in just a moment. Well, Scholz closed the three-day summit saying Russia was causing a hunger crisis through its war on Ukraine. He said a new Marshall Plan was needed to help Ukraine rebuild. G7 members also condemned Russia's latest attack on a shopping mall in central Ukraine. Well, with me here in the studio is DW's chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane. Also covering the G7 events at the summit itself in Bavaria for us is DW's Brussels bureau chief, Alexander von Naumann. She, I understand, has moved on. And we now have Michaela Kufner, our chief political editor, on site for us. And let's cross over to her now. We saw you there fielding, actually asking a question to Chancellor Scholz a short while ago. Michaela, tell us more about the press conference. What did the Chancellor have to say, and how significant is that in the context of what's been happening at the G7 so far?
Well, of course, this was overshadowed by Ukraine, so I did ask him whether security guarantees were given to Ukraine, whether there was a discussion amongst the G7, and you can see right behind me, actually, the press conference is just wrapping up as we speak here. We heard some thunder and lightning approaching as well, so it's a thunderous finale here at the G7 summit. You just see Olaf Scholz walking off the stage there right now, and he, as the final question got, whether it was time now to really reattach with Russia, have some kind of discussions with Russia. And he said, well, this is a moment where there still really is no end in sight of the Ukraine crisis, of the war Russia is waging there. We saw a condemnation by G7 leaders of the attack on a supermarket. It was put in parallel with the word war crime, and you see Olaf Scholz walking off into the landscape there, but he's about to take a left turn and walk back up the road to Elmau Castle, which is right behind me. It was also the backdrop to that press conference that is just concluded here at Elmau after 3 days of that G7 G7 summit that, of course, was completely overshadowed by Russia. What he did announce is that he would seek a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, that he was seeking to organize a conference together with the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, that substantial assistance was needed. And you see here, I'm actually standing right on that structure that you see in there, the top left corner, with that press conference wrapping up at Elmau. The beautiful backdrop could at times deflect from what is at stake here, because we are seeing a geopolitical reshuffle in the making, and that's also why Olaf Scholz put such an emphasis on inviting those important democracies who've turned to become economic powerhouses already of the present and the future, namely, of course, India, also Indonesia, which holds the G20 presidency. And there I also asked Olaf Scholz whether the G7 came to an agreement, whether they will actually sit down together with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, who has announced that he will indeed attend the G20 meeting coming up next week. And Olaf Scholz responded that, yes, the G7 will be there. Germany also will be there as part of the G7, because the last thing anybody wants here is to see a format that is so important for this shifting geostrategic reorder to be dispersed.
We heard Chancellor Scholz at the beginning of his statement there following the G7 meeting say that not only did the G7 condemn the attack on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also that this is a watershed moment, that this is a defining moment, very much so. The way that Germany at least deals with Russia can never go back to the way it was before the invasion. And he says we're entering a time of uncertainty. This is a critical moment also for Germany's role within the international community, trying to show leadership under a new chancellor following Angela Merkel's long tenure. How did Chancellor Scholz stand up to the challenges facing him under these conditions?
Well, I mean, certainly Germany holds the G7 presidency. That's why all this is taking place here. He was actually specifically asked why those bits of information that we got about the discussions going on behind the scenes, they came mainly through the US delegation here. We also saw a really dominant Joe Biden when he announced the infrastructure initiative by the G7 worldwide, some 600 billion put on the table. A lot of that not fresh money, but it does sound huge, to have something to counter China's Belt and Road strategy, and Germany being a lot more cautious when it comes to taking a stance towards China. Now, you can see this as a dominant US president here at the G7 and a German chancellor not quite taking that complete leadership role, but it also shows that Joe Biden is under pressure domestically, that there really is not that terribly much stamina to continue facing the pressure of inflation, of rising fuel and food prices. That is a global phenomenon, and really where Olaf Scholz, I think, scored quite a few points also amongst the G7 leaders here, is to bring those partners on board to really get across the message that this is caused by Russia and not caused by the sanctions imposed against Russia by the West. That was the struggle here, but no doubt this was dominated by the US.
Michaela, stay with us because we have a clip from that press conference with Olaf Scholz. Let's listen in to what he had to say.
G7 stands together in their support for Ukraine. We agree that President Putin must not win this war, and we will continue to support, and we will drive the costs high economically and politically for President Putin. And that's why it's important to stand together. Even if it's a long course, we will have to stand.
So the G7 leaders obviously trying to come up with an answer to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How did that play out for Chancellor Scholz at this G7? Michaela?
Well, I mean, he's not quite able to disperse the criticism of being too hesitant. But what did happen is that he got heaps of praise from Joe Biden. It almost felt a bit patronizing at times, actually, because Joe Biden said that it was also thanks to the leadership, very strong leadership he's seen from Olaf Scholz, that there were some questions over the transition, meaning the transition from Merkel to the Scholz administration here in Germany. But it was thanks to his leadership. So, you know, that of course helps, but at the same time, it felt a bit like the true leader of the free world handing out some compliments there. We understand he did do quite a bit of mediation behind the scenes. Not all G7 countries are on the same page. There are gaps that remain when it comes to CO2 emissions, CO2 pricing, very much seen as a European concept that certainly does not translate across the Atlantic to the United States and Japan, for instance. So there's quite a few issues where G7 leaders don't really have unity, but Ukraine is the one where they announced areas where they want to introduce new sanctions, including the defense industry, the goods there, but also services are supposed to be affected, also more individuals. But those areas were announced. We have not actually seen those being implemented and put into force. The same on the price cap for oil. That's an intention that the G7 are still working on.
So, hesitancy. Melinda, if you're just joining us, this is Melinda Crane, our chief political correspondent in the studio, who's also been following all of these speeches today. Melinda, we just heard Michaela refer to the notion of hesitancy in association with Olaf Scholz's leadership. It's a criticism that has been levied at him quite a lot, particularly since the beginning of the Ukraine war, Russia's war against Ukraine. How was this summit for Olaf Scholz as a leader, particularly given that the G7, like NATO, is dominated largely by the United States?
Well, certainly we heard a lot of professions of unity, as Michaela said, also praise from Joe Biden and praise as well from the Chancellor for the U.S. and the strength of the transatlantic relationship. But the fact is, for all of those who thought that on February 27th, when Chancellor Scholz gave his now legendary speech in the Bundestag, basically calling the Ukraine war a turning point, and for all of those who believe that that meant this is the moment when Germany steps up and punches at its weight in terms of taking leadership on the international stage, I don't think that they will have found this G7 to be a definitive manifestation that Germany now is going in that direction. We saw, for me at least, a fairly hesitant and cautious Olaf Scholz there in this final communique. If I look at what the U.S. said in background remarks earlier today, and there's a readout of that call that is publicly available, there were much more definitive statements, for example, on China. China clearly remains foremost in the U.S. perspective, despite the fact that Russia and Ukraine were very much the top of the agenda at this meeting. But the infrastructure initiative, for example, that Michaela just mentioned, that's all about countering Belt and Road. China's outreach to countries in the global south on infrastructure. This is about trying to come up with a Western alternative. And in general, what I hear when I hear not only Scholz's comments, but also those of the French President Macron, is a strong awareness of what Scholz called Putin's trap, namely his narrative that this war essentially is about the West versus the rest. It's the West's war. It's the West with its actions that is driving fuel and food price spikes that are hurting all of the global South. There's a very strong awareness here, obviously, of that narrative. Scholz spoke about trying to counter the Russian narrative. But when you look at what this summit concretely delivers, there hasn't been any concrete statement about how that grain gets out of Black Sea ports. That's an ongoing discussion, but they were not able to say anything definitive on that. Now, we do have the 4.5 billion euros being committed to greater food security. That's outreach toward the Global South. We had the meeting that invited the leaders of Argentina, Senegal, South Africa, India, and Indonesia yesterday. Clearly, behind the scenes, there must have been discussions with them about their imports of Russian fossil fuels and whether they were willing to go long on some form of a price cap, and no results there. We did hear some vague declarations afterward about the way that G7 countries will be cooperating with them to try to boost renewable energy and green investment and so on. But all in all, if you look at what some of those leaders who met yesterday with the G7 said afterward, including South Africa, which gave interviews here to the German media, that basically they're not ready to take sides here. They are not ready to say the Western narrative is the one that we're going with. What they said, the South African foreign minister, is that for them, this is the West's game, and they're staying neutral.
This has been a particularly interesting summit in that with these crises in the world, both the security crisis here in Europe with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also the food security crisis that we're seeing, the climate crisis, these are all converging to make this a very highly pressurized summit like none I've seen before. I've covered a couple of them myself. We've got some sound bites, of course, coming from those press conferences today that we want to play for you as well. Let's listen in to what else was said at the end of this important G7 summit in Germany.
We want to do justice to our global responsibility. This applies to climate protection. We talked about the question of a climate club, which I proposed quite some time ago, and that's why we agreed, and I'm very happy to say that we will be setting up such a climate club by the end of the year. We laid the cornerstone here, and the next steps have already been agreed on, because we agree we need more ambition in order to achieve our climate targets. The climate club will make a contribution to meeting these commitments.
Let's cross over to our chief political editor, Michaela Kuppner, who has attended that press conference and actually asked a question to the Chancellor himself. Michaela, we just heard Chancellor Scholz talking about a climate club, an effort, again, to combat climate change. It's something that has been coming up again and again at past summits of the G7 leaders. Did you get a sense that this particular summit was tackling that issue with the way that that was going to make a difference?
Time will tell. But what is clear is that climate had to take a backseat at this summit. The Climate Club was supposed to be the highlight issue, the highlight theme of the G7 presidency of Germany, and then came Ukraine. And what we've seen is essentially the invites to this climate club sent out. It involves a recommitment to the 1.5-degree climate goal, a real commitment to renewable energy, and in this very same statement, we see the G7, the richest industrialized nations, whose industrialization was almost solely built on CO2 emission, saying under these exceptional circumstances of the Ukraine war, we need to cross our own red line, only written down last November in Glasgow, and allow for public investment in yet more fossil fuels for the time being. Now, that really is not very much of a climate message, and that was also the criticism of many people demonstrating here, although it was less than in the previous time.
Melinda, just briefly, we've got Chancellor Scholz there trying to show leadership on climate change, being frustrated by the war in Ukraine. Also difficult for Germany to show leadership in dealing with Russia's invasion. How difficult of a G7 summit was this for Chancellor Scholz?
The mountains to climb are pretty amazing and dramatic, as we could see in the images from Elmo. And you know, they're out there with their walking sticks trying to reach the summit, but it is an enormous challenge.
Melinda, thank you very much. Our chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane, also on location there in Bavaria at the summit. Our chief political editor, Michaela Kuppner. Thank you to you both. You are watching DW News. Thanks for being with us.